So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the article, The Decline of Cash Assistance and the Well-Being of Poor Households with Children. But before we do that, I want to point out something, because I think that we end up often with arguments about what sociologists would call social stratification means that are kind of a false dichotomy. So this week we're talking about inequality, and mainly when we talk about inequality in sociology we mean class inequality, as opposed to our other weeks where we're going to talk about gender, we're going to talk about race. Of course, in reality, all these things are intertwined. So what I want to kind of get us thinking about, and the reason why I'm going to throw this graph up, is I want us to think about social stratification. And I want us to, one, know what this word means, as well as kind of see the trends for what they are, rather than how we often will talk about them. So, is anybody familiar with this term, social stratification? Does anybody know what's happening with social classes worldwide?
Becoming more separated?
Yeah, they become more separated. That process is referred to as social stratification. So that means that worldwide inequality is on the rise and has been for some time. Arguably, inequality has been increasing at least since the 19th century. So very long periods of time. So we're talking about very long flows. And this graph only goes back to 1980, in which this is a more exponential period of stratification growth. But if we were to drag this, all the way back to the 19th century, you would also see a very similar sort of trend of people having been closer in terms of inequality, right? But now having much greater, wider gaps between it. I think we hear about this enough that it's no longer surprising. Like 10 years ago when I would teach this, you would say this and people would be like, no, that can't be true. But now you hear about the 1% and all that quite a bit. I actually took this graph from the New York Times. It's a little more readable than some of the more, better sources. So that's why I kind of included it. Any question about that so far? All that makes sense? So what does that mean practically? Because we get two ways that we normally think about inequality. One, we have a sort of a narrative that floats around our culture often that everybody is getting wealthier and that things are going better and better all the time. That's one set of narratives. And what's the opposite of that? So we either view us on a sort of progressive, linear, upward trajectory. What's sort of the opposite of that? What is another way of thinking about inequality and poverty in the United States that you hear a lot of? That it's getting worse and worse all the time. Both of these are false, and there's a nuance here. So there's a difference between what we refer to as absolute and relative poverty. So absolute poverty is when you are so poor that it's life-threatening. Relative poverty is when you're poor in comparison to others. Both are significant, but they're different. So what may be an example of life-threatening poverty, absolute poverty? What populations?
Homeless people.
Yeah, homeless people suffer from absolute poverty. Most homeless people will be killed by their poverty. Life expectancy amongst homeless people is very short. Regardless of when they become homeless. So if they get home, essentially there's only so many years that they're likely to be on the street and survive that. So that's a good example of absolute poverty. Any other Any other examples of populations that have absolute poverty?
Like third world countries.
Yeah, in a lot of countries, absolute poverty is much higher than in the United States. The United States has pretty low absolute poverty rates, larger than most Western democracies, but lower than a good chunk of the world. Worldwide, absolute poverty is on the rise, but in Western democracies, it's decreasing. Sometimes Native Americans in the United States have forms of absolute poverty. You think about things like I think I brought up in this class before, surrounding this sort of like justice stuff we read last week, that a lot of Native American tribes, they have environmental degradation and stuff like that, to the point where they're very likely to die very early from cancer, through radiation exposure, things like that. So there are examples of like life-threatening poverty in the United States. They're just not as common. Instead, we have relative poverty. So relative poverty is literally sort of like, in comparison to other people, I am poorer. So what's the downside to as opposed to absolute poverty? What are some of the bad things about relative poverty? Why do we care about relative poverty? What do you think? Because like, if it's not going to threaten your life, why is it important? Yeah.
I don't know, you can't really like own like a lot or like very nice things, so it might make you like feel bad.
So yeah, a lot of, you think about our social stigma stuff before, right? Like people who are poor are talked about very disparagingly in the United States. They're treated as second-class citizens. There may be other things that are tied up that they get exposed to as a result of their poverty, right? So you think about things like incarceration rates, which we talked about last week, right? That's a symptom of our relative poverty in the United States. Not the absolute poverty, but the relative poverty, right? So that's so in terms of relative poverty is on the rise in the United States. Absolute poverty is not. So now I'll point to the graph. So what is the graph showing? What do we see happening? It's pretty obvious just by looking at it. So since 1980, 5 years before my birth, what has happened in trends of social stratification in the United States?
Slowly increasing.
Yeah, well, I would say, I don't even know if that would be slowly increasing.
Well,
It's,
most of them are slowly increasing.
yeah, well, no, yeah, totally. Most social classes are slowly gaining essentially things like purchasing power, right? So our standard of living actually does increase in the United States. It just increases very slowly for most of the population. What's the exception? Yeah, the top 0.01%, right? The top 1% grows a lot faster than the other classes, but it's the top 0.01% that grows extremely fast, right? So another way to think about it is we have a growth economy in the United States. All capitalist economies are growth economies, but that growth is not sort of distributed evenly in the United States, and in fact, increasingly becomes distributed more unevenly. Why is that important? Why might we care about that? What comes along with having so much more wealth than most of the population?
You like control the prices of things, I guess. Like
Yeah.
power, I guess.
Yeah. So in this essence, the reason why this is disconcerting for most people is it actually shows the clear distribution of power breaking apart, right? With money, you can buy influence, you can buy all kinds of things, right? So basically, people's control over the economy, as well as people's control over the government, is becoming increasingly stratified, meaning that we are significantly less democratic than we were 20 years ago, right? And so that's actually kind of the disconcerting thing.
Would you argue that because of how significantly like more like stratified or like separated the top 0.1% is from the 1%,
Yeah.
that is more like the concerning population, if you will? Because I feel like the 1% is still pretty close or within range to everyone else.
Yeah.
But then you have the top 0.1% that is so completely separated from society. So it's just that one group that is more. So because we often hear just the top 1%, but I feel like there's that group within the top 1% that's actually what they're talking about.
Yeah, and I think that probably is a distinction that we fail to make. Because there's also a difference in like who these elites are and where they live. There's elite studies is a big thing in sociology as well, study of like how essentially elite culture works, stuff like that. And one of the things that particularly C. Wright Mills, who wrote a book on elites, talked about was the death of the local elite. So if you look at like most small towns in America, and particularly you can really feel this, that there's like you walk around Atchison, there's some huge old shacks here, right? Have you guys ever noticed that? And like really expensive, it would have been really expensive to make them at one time. Yet we don't see anything quite so grand being built in Atchison anymore, right? It's sort of this remnant of the past, often falling apart remnant of the past. Why is that, right? Well, actually, it's partially because of the stratification that you're talking about, right? We no longer have local elites. Essentially, the elites that run our economy and our government are in other states, not other countries. You're not really aware of it, right? So we have no way of dialoguing with them. And in that way, things have gotten, in some ways, harsher. Because like where before elites had a tendency to live amongst other people and take care of them to some degree, that becomes decreasingly true over time. So no, that's a really good point. So everyone kind of has mildly increasing standards of living in the United States, some of us very slowly and some of us very rapidly. Right. We're going to talk about, on Friday, I'm going to talk a little bit about changing class structures. And we're going to look at, in some ways, the same phenomenon through a different lens, which is the lens of like what kind of work people do and how it's changed in the course of the last, particularly 100 years. Okay. Any questions about social stratification or comments people want to make? Okay. So let's turn to our article. So that was just sort of an overarching thing to kind of get us into the world of inequality. Have you figured out sociology is like the discipline where you go to hear about depressing things? They're interesting, but they're usually not very happy. Okay, so let's talk about the decline of child assistance and the well-being of poor households with children. So just so we know, what is most of, you guys, there's a lot of debate about welfare. Do you guys know what welfare is? You hear people throw this word around. What is welfare?
I know it's something with money and like the amount, like, I don't know, the amount of money people have for the country.
Isn't it like government funded for people that like don't have enough money? They try to help them out in a way.
Like how comfortable somebody's living, like their happiness, I guess, or
Yeah.
I
I mean, that is a different definition than what we're using here. Go ahead.
I think most often when it's thrown around, people talk about like entitlement programs,
Yeah.
like when they throw it around.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different definitions. If you were to see this on a line item of the government, welfare is basically anything that's done to take care of people. But generally speaking, in colloquial terms, most people use the term welfare to describe a handful of policies that are a handful of money that's distributed by the government to keep people out of absolute poverty, right? So it's usually to aid people who are impoverished. Does anybody know which poor people were more or less likely to take care of in the United States?
Like, the absolute poverty.
Actually, we'll see. No, not at all. Yeah. We basically, in the United States, we usually just give money for children, right? So most of our programs are for children. Sometimes other populations can gain access to something called SNAP, which is something that replaced food stamps. But depending on the states, that's not even possible. So really, it's just women and children that are capable, usually, of getting money and funds from the government to, and sometimes families, depending state by state, right? That to help with issues of poverty, right? So this article is particularly looking at how the way in which we talk and think about that money that's allocated for it, for this purpose, changes. Just as an aside, does the United States give a lot of money to help poor people? No, we give significantly less than every other Western democracy in the world. That's going to be like a running theme in this class sometimes, right? In comparison to other Western democracies, a lot of our actions are very different in the United States. And that's true of the way in which we treat poverty. Our social safety net is significantly smaller in the United States. But you can kind of, has anybody here ever been abroad? Like, anybody here been to Europe? You can kind of feel the difference between most, particularly Western European countries and the United States when you go, simply by the fact that, like, there isn't as much poverty in most Western European countries. But anyways, getting back to the point. So this is looking at a specific changes in policy with this one area of welfare, the largest area of welfare, which is stuff for dependent women and children. Okay. Do anybody catch this idea of deserving and undeserving poor? That's talked about throughout the article. This is a reframing that happens in the 1990s. So what do we consider deserving poor in the United States? Who deserves money?
They talk about like single mothers, like single mothers like need the money for their families.
So yeah, so that's the overarching program. That's most of our welfare program, right? But within that, not all single mothers that are impoverished get help. What determines what kind of help or how much help they get?
Isn't like the big part of it is whether they have like a constant job or not?
Yeah. We define deserving poor as poor people who are employed full-time. And undeserving poor is basically everyone else.
Like, so one of the things that they're saying is that like the aid to like the more like the very, very poor people, like so like the absolute poor, like has been like decreasing.
Yes.
And, like, so I think that's what I meant earlier, and so like that means that the real like the other people are getting more, like the balance is off. Is that what?
Yeah. So the essentially what's being defined as the deserving poor, those who are employed full time. These are usually people right on the edge of the poverty line. So they're sometimes not actually impoverished, or if they are, they're just below the line that would indicate them as being impoverished. This population is the one that receives the most benefits, even though they're actually a smaller population. And what we would define as the undeserving poor, those who are actually underemployed, are receiving less and less over time since the 1990s. First of all, I want to point out, one thing, and this is, who is this money going to help? What population?
Relative?
Children. Right? So, I just want to venture, like, is there kind of a weirdness to talk about deserving and undeserving poor children? Yeah, so I want to just point that out, right? So, like, this isn't money being given to adult males who could easily be working. We don't really have much support for adult males. Usually, impoverished adult males end up in prison more than they're likely to receive aid. Unless they're disabled or something like that, right? So we're talking about deserving versus undeserving poor. There's a framing mechanism to talk about children and whether children get benefits. That's really kind of what we're talking about. Does anybody notice another difference between, in our current policy, between deserving and undeserving poor? What kind of benefits do they receive? This is the cash versus in kind. Do you guys catch this? So cash assistance is what? This is the obvious name. Money. Yeah, it's literally receiving funds from the government. What's in kind? Receiving aid in kind. What do you think? It's not money, right? What's an example of things that we give as aid that are not money?
Food stamps?
Yeah. So in kind, this includes things like food stamps. Now it's called SNAP. Used to be called WIC, right? So just different names for the policies over time. So essentially, we receive food, housing. Well, actually, no. Housing usually goes here. They didn't talk about this in the article, but you have to prove that you have enough income to get an apartment usually to get federally subsidized housing, which also seems kind of weird. Just as an aside, I was like acquaintances with a homeless couple when I was living in Richmond, Virginia, and I was helping them do paperwork to try to get housing. We showed up to the social work, and the social worker point blank said, "You can only get housing in Virginia if you don't need it." Right? But that was like kind of a crazy thing just to like point blank say to them, like, if you need housing, the government's not really willing to provide it. But that's kind of the idea, right? So food is a good example. Medicine, you receive things like food or medicine. So the poorer you are, the more likely you are to get in kind. The wealthier are you, the more likely you are to get cash subsistence. Okay, so it's kind of a weird system, right? First of all, did anybody catch who decides how this money gets used? Right? State by state. So it also makes it really hard to talk about. Each individual state defines their own. Has anybody ever been into an estate where they have certain foods that you can buy with WIC or not? Has anybody ever seen this?
Yeah. If you go to the store and they have like the milk that has the WIC sticker and then they have the normal milk and you have to like pick the right one.
Yeah. Does anybody notice which ones, when that's usually done, which products you're allowed to buy and which ones you aren't? In a lot of states, it's the more expensive food is the only food you're allowed to buy. Main brands, because the main brands are allowed to pay into it. So you can't buy generic food, right? Things like that, right? So there's a lot of weird ironies in kind often. Care and kind. What's some of the, so if you're thinking about like, let's take for example, you're a mother who is unemployed with children. What's the difficulty of only receiving in-kind aid? Just thinking through this.
Well, if she has like children, like I'm assuming that they would need to go to school, so like they would need money to like buy books or like school supplies and stuff like that. So we can't really do with like the medicine and food.
Yeah, what else?
Well, if they're not
house and she has to pay some kind of rent and you need cash to do that.
Yeah, and we'll look at eviction rates in the United States, the climbing eviction rates in the United States on Wednesday. There's a lot of incidentals too, like you need cash for like everything, or you need money, right? Not necessarily cash, but you need money for like everything, right? And a lot of times if you don't have the funds available to like pay for something like you accidentally, I don't know, drive through a tollway or something, if you don't pay for it immediately, then it just gets more expensive, right? So a lot of this ends up becoming like, the poor people become essentially nickeled and dimed to death as a result of not actually receiving cash aid. So that's kind of one of the ironies, right? Is if one of the groups needed cash aid more, it would probably be what the United States defines as undeserving poor, right? As opposed to deserving, yet that's not the relationship, right? Okay. I want to turn your guys' attention to page, because now the question is like, why do we have this weird system? Right? Where does this come from? And so if we go to page 1002, there's this nice history, which I think is a super interesting history, at least I thought it was interesting, of aid programs to women in the United States. So starting with that sort of second full paragraph, right, and moving through, I think we should just like move through what happens in different periods. So they may catch what happens in the colonial period of the United States. It continues really until the 19th century. So early United States, what kind of aid do they give to women? Yeah, so yeah, very early on you receive in-kind aid if you're a widow, right? What's the significance of being a widow, do you think?
I have a husband to take care of you, represent you.
So one is, yeah, you don't have a husband, what kinds of who can do gainful employment in the 1700s, do you think? Men. Who can own property in the 1700s? Men. Women don't legally gain the right to own property until the late 1800s in the United States. You know, so like, quite literally, like, you know, if you were widowed with children, like you needed somebody to help you, essentially. You could supplement your income a little, but you're not the law, right? So people, they received in kind, right? In the 19th century, this changed. Did anybody catch what the policy in the 19th century was on how to treat women with children that are impoverished? Yeah, they split up their families. So that's kind of the general policy, is that they take the children away from impoverished mothers. What do they do with the impoverished mothers? This is in the middle of the second paragraph. They let them try to find work, and they might end up in a poorhouse, right? Which is kind of like, it's a prison for poor people, basically. What happens to the children?
Orphanages or foster care.
Yeah, they go into orphanages or foster care. This is where the image comes from. You always hear like things about orphans, right? Like this is that period, right? So there's a period where they're essentially like, if a family can't make it, we just split them up and send them to different places, right? Send the children to an orphanage, send the adults to the poorhouse, right? And then that's that. So does that sound like a good solution to you? No, and it doesn't. It doesn't really help with poverty. It's not a very good solution. Essentially, it's just how dealing with a surplus population, much like we do today in a lot of ways, like we just learned by locking them up. That's kind of still our policy for poor males. So what does this replaced by? So starting in the 20th century, they slowly unravel this orphanage system. And they replace it with something else. You may catch what they replace it with.
The Mother's Day programs?
Yeah, they start with Mother's AIDS programs. Eventually those Mother AIDS programs become the ADA, later called the AFCD. All of these are basically the same policy. It's receiving money from the government to take care of your children. What's the philosophy behind this? Did anybody catch this?
It's more important for the families to stay together.
What's that?
It's more important for the families to stay together.
Yeah, so one philosophy is that in some ways, like the proper caretaker of children are their parents, right? So if you're a single window, in this case, often in this time frame, a widow, right, taking care of your children, or somebody who's been abandoned by their husband, you really kind of need that support, right? What else is what else is being valued here? There's something very specific.
Kind of like, I'm sorry, the quality of life of the children. So like, they want them to be okay and like taken care of.
Yeah. What else?
Kind of hope for the next generation, like the next group of laborers, so it would be the children, kind of hoping that they're going to become more part of the workforce later, and that can't happen if they die.
Yeah. Yeah, so part of that is by doing that support, essentially the children are more likely to end up being viable, right? That's kind of part of the idea. There's something that we talk about, we also sometimes talk about it in terms of family values that's particularly popping up here. Did you have something to add, Charles?
I was just gonna say, like, it helps infants, and then also, like, success in the future, success for kids, but okay.
Kind of grows out of like a culture that highly values stay-at-home mothers, right? That's actually something that's popping up in here too, right? So like, whether or not, and I'm not saying like, regardless of how you react to it, right? But like in the early 20th century, the idea is that in some ways like the proper place of a woman was to stay at home, right? And in a weird way that actually helps a lot of impoverished women in this era because in essence the government's willing to fund, subsidize, right, them being able to stay at home and take care of their kids, right? Make sense? So this is sort of like, if you will, this is the heyday of American welfare programs. Still often not enough money to actually live off of, but by and large, right, like being taken care of. So what happens? What happens in particular, like let's think about like what happens, so we're talking early 20th century, what happens like the 60s and 70s in terms of women in the workforce? What's the transformations that happened in the mid-20th century? You all know this. Women didn't work, right?
Well, then we have like World War II and Vietnam War, so women were kind of felt their responsibility to join the workforce. You know, like Rosie Griffith or anyone starts working.
Yeah, and essentially we have, oh, go ahead, Charles.
Well, women start going to college and then start marrying later and accepting higher paying jobs.
So yeah, so essentially women now have access to the workforce, right? Still not equal, right? Still not equal to this day, but access to the workforce. So how does that transform our attitudes towards poor women?
I think it made, because women were like, oh, you have to view us as equal, and the government stopped giving them the treatment. But also they didn't want to view them as like the stay-at-home mothers that they were once viewed as, and so.
I guess you could say it's like the beginning of the whole deserving and undeserving idea, because you start saying, okay, well, like these women work and these don't, and so you start to like think about that.
Yeah. So essentially, like our stance as a government is that essentially they devalued women staying at home with their children, and instead valued whether they were working full time. This is where a lot of our mythos about like, which I say mythos because it's not really a true thing. This all like, have people like heard this idea of sort of like welfare queen kind of thing, where people like pump out a bunch of children to become really wealthy off of the welfare state? You guys have probably heard this idea before, right? It's not empirically true. It doesn't exist. It's just like, in some ways, it's a latent fear of our culture, and you see that like logic definitely like bleeding into here, right? That like, and in essence, like if and this is kind of the funny thing is like do we generally consider it good if an upper middle class mom decides she wants to stay home with her kids? Yeah, we generally often culturally view that as a really positive thing, right? Culturally, do we view it as a positive thing if poor women stay home with their kids? No, we instead view them as pariahs, right? Which is a really interesting thing, because how much work does it take to stay at home with your kids? Are people aware of this? Yeah, kids are a lot of work, right? And actually, like, there's studies to show that children are actually becoming more work, not less. People spend more time with their working on, like, taking care of their children than they did 50 or 60 years ago. So you think about so it's basically like that devaluation of women's work, right, if you will. Like, women who are not a part of the workforce, we basically view them as not working. If they take care of their children, we view them as not working. And as such, we treat them that way. That's kind of the idea, right? So that's the birth of this deserving, undeserving poor. And to some degree, this becomes the birth of what's referred to often as welfare reform, right? And so welfare reform essentially pushes us into this kind of weird system. Okay, did anybody catch the outcomes of this on children's well-being in the United States? So we did this shift, and this study is basically like a study mapping, right? Like, how is it that the well-being of children changed as a result of this policy in the 90s? We're now 30 years into it, right? What happened to children? They have a measure of well-being that they're using, probably because, like, there's no, like, it's a general rule, abstract concepts can't be directly measured, so you gotta, like, find something to measure, right? Especially if you're gonna run statistics on it. And so what they're doing to measure well-being, did anybody catch what the variable was? It's homelessness. Did people catch that? So what happens to the homeless rates of people, underage people, during this period? It climbs, right? What's the significance of? So first of all, like, what's the significance of young people under the age of 15 being homeless?
Like, reduces the number of people that will go into the workforce, and it increases the number of people who are going to be homeless and on the streets and stuff.
What's something you probably won't get if you are a homeless 14-year-old?
Education.
Yeah, you probably will not make it through high school. Being homeless is hard. You know, so if you think about, like, if rates, particularly rates amongst urban African Americans, you know, you get higher and higher child homelessness rates, what's going to happen to that population? They're going to stay what? They're going to stay impoverished, right? This is something we often don't talk about. Who becomes poor in the United States? People who start poor. There's actually very little of what's called social mobility in the United States, either downward or upward. There's more downward, we'll talk about that on Friday. But it's very unlikely, despite the fact that we always tell ourselves this. We have all these movies about, like, success stories where people, I don't know, like, come from being homeless to being CEOs of major corporations or something, right? The thing is that this is a mythology. It's not really real either, right? Generally speaking, people just end up where they start. And why is that, right? It's because of these sort of pressures being placed on you as a result of your social class, right? So social classes, and this is the term sociologists use, replicate over time. In various ways, various mechanisms cause that replication. One of which is that basically, like, lacking access to education replicates poverty among certain groups. A lot of times in the United States, we refer to the population that's always impoverished as the permanent underclass. And they are, right? You talk about these are terms that were being thrown around in the article, right? Intergenerational poverty, right? intergenerational poverty is very common. So basically, like, you're talking about families often that are 3, 4, 5 generations deep, or have, for as long as time can be remembered amongst their family, been impoverished. And that's actually most of the people in the United States in poverty. So, like, the idea of, and going back to like this idea of deserving versus undeserving, right? Like, people don't get what they deserve, they just kind of get what they get. And even like, you can think about things like most people in college come from what class in the United States? What do you think? This is the one that everybody likes to claim to be. Middle class, right? So if you're an upper class kid, what school do you go? What kind of school do you go to? What kind of college do you go to? If you're like one of the .01ers, what kind of school are you going to go to?
An Ivy League.
You might go to an Ivy League school, maybe some really fancy state school. You know, maybe some school none of you guys have ever heard of, but is like a place that basically just churns out elite kids, right? That's really common, small, prestigious liberal arts schools. If you're middle class, what kind of college do you go to? Actually, trade schools would usually be working class. Which we'll get into what these definitions are.
State school.
Community colleges?
Community colleges usually serve working class or people who are transitioning, sort of lower middle class people.
Like a state school or university.
Yeah, state schools, colleges, right? And what happens? Each of those levels, right, people replicate their class, right? So like, you come here to gain capital so that you can get a white collar middle class job on the other end, right? People who are wealthy go to an elite college so that they come out and they get jobs in like Goldman Sachs or whatever, right? And then like, if you're poor, you don't go to school and you replicate that over time, right? So like, our opportunities cause this sort of constant replication of class, which is by and large in the United States pretty stagnant. So, okay, any other questions for the last couple minutes we have? Cool. Have a good day. We'll talk about evictions on Wednesday. And like I said, I'll give us a history of social class on Friday. Understanding how modernity altered social class, how it continues to alter, stuff like that. What that means for you guys, most likely, in your future.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I know you said,